Welcome back to The Human Perspective. And today we're going to be talking with Pauline Castres. I'm Judy Human, and let me give you my visual description. I'm a white 73, almost 74 disabled woman. I have brown hair onto my shoulders. I'm wearing a blue turtleneck, and we're in the foyer of my apartment. So welcome, Pauline. So very nice to meet you again.
Thanks so much, Judy, and thanks so much for having me in the program. So I'm a white woman who's going to turn 33 in a few days. I have glasses, brown hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a dark blue dress. The background is my living room. There is a green wall in the back and a white door to my right.
So talk to us a little bit about who you are.
So I am many things, but the main thing I would say is I am a policy expert. So I spent over 10 years working in policy with the UK government, with EU institutions, with the UN and many different NGOs. So my areas of expertise have been climate change, global health, and disability rights. And I actually became more interested in the issue of disability and climate because when I worked in climate change, I only heard about disability as a result of climate change and not really as disabled people being empowered to be part of the movement. And later on, when I worked on disability rights and the implementation of the UN CRPD, it became apparent that there were very little conversations about climate change in the disability space. So it became clear to me that after worked in that space for 10 years, it was almost a burning desire to bring those two spaces together, having worked with climate activists and seeing that ableism is quite rampant in that space, and having worked with disability activists and seeing that climate wasn't high on the list of priorities. I saw I need to join the movement because some people have already done things on the ground, but there is so much more that can be done.
Do you define yourself as a disabled person?
I do. So I have a disability called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which affects pretty much everything in my life. You can have problems with your joints, but that's not the only thing. It's hypermobility in the whole body.
And why did you get involved with environmental issues?
So I think I became really interested in the climate justice movement when I became disabled 13 years ago, because it was really interesting for me to experience and be labeled as becoming vulnerable. And in the climate conversation, there is always this idea of vulnerability. And at the same time, there is this big conversation about climate resilience. And I was expected constantly to be resilient. So I think there was almost there's literally a visceral explanation behind being interested in climate, is this idea that the world is becoming a much darker place and everything is changing. At the same time, you're being labeled as vulnerable. So I wanted to bring together those concepts of vulnerability and resilience, and how it's actually because we're marginalized that we are vulnerable, and what is climate resilience if it's not inclusive.
How do you define eco-ableism?
Eco-ableism is the discrimination in favor of non-disabled people in climate conversations. It means that when there is measures and policy action that are taken to either mitigate, so reduce the impact of climate change, so reduce temperature increase, CO2 emissions, or to adapt to the fact that climate is a reality that is going to happen and change everything, disabled people were completely excluded and forgotten, and eventually impacted by the measures that were aimed to fight climate change. So if we look at the plastic straw, it's a really great example because it happened overnight, and there was a lot of PR and a lot of noise, a lot of greenwashing around it. Because if you look at the data, plastic straw pollution is actually a really, really small proportion of overall single-use plastic, which is in itself a big issue. It's clogging oceans and that needs to be dealt with. But overnight, using a plastic straw became the symbol of not caring about the planet. And I think a lot of disabled people struggle first not being seen as being part of the movement when so many want to. And secondly, how it restricted our access to communities. If you went to a restaurant, you would just be told, well, no, that's not available. The plastic straw became the symbol of a much bigger issue, and all the focus was on it. But eventually it was directed towards disabled people and our autonomy.
Yeah, and I think, as you're saying, it's a small percentage of environmental damage being done by the plastic straws. For me, a much better battle would be getting rid of water in plastic bottles.
Yeah, no, definitely. And food packaging, sometimes you've got so many layers of plastic on food. I think so many people are bombarded by ideas and things to do about climate, and they don't know what to do. And then their minds goes and focuses on one thing. And it's also because climate change is such an anxiety-inducing issue that you want to go to what can I do about it? But your brain is going to go to that. And it means that, unfortunately, sometimes there are shortcuts to things like the plastic straw, which actually harm communities, including ours.
How does climate change, or do you believe climate change disproportionately impacts disabled people?
Yeah, so the short answer would be yes. The first thing is that we are 4 times more likely to die during a natural disaster. And actually, 1 in 5 disabled people would now struggle to evacuate safely during, a flood or a hurricane. And that's data from the UN DDD, so disaster reduction risk. So they've assembled some data. And they've also found that only 17% of disabled people know about warning systems and who to call and what to do in the event of an emergency. If there is something that happens, is information available, accessible? No, and people do not know who to turn to. How do you evacuate safely? And if you have to migrate somewhere else, if you got to go to a shelter, are your needs going to be met there? Usually not, unfortunately. And I think if you look at Hurricane Maria, what happened in Puerto Rico is that 1/3 of the deaths linked to the hurricane were actually linked to disabled people not having access to the medical care that they would usually have access to. So the first thing is we're more likely to die, and if we don't, we are extremely likely to be put in an environment that isn't tailored to our needs, where we're going to be told, this is emergency, you just have to deal with it, which goes completely against a disability human rights approach to disability. The second aspect of how we are impacted by climate change is in the fact that 20% of the world's poorest people are disabled, and a lot of disabled people will become poor. They will lose livelihoods. They will lose, access to the thing that they have. If there is a drought and there is no money, how are you going to pay for your wheelchair or your wheelchair to be repaired? Or how are you going to have access to education if your family becomes poor and decides not to send you to school? Imagine if there is a flood, a heat wave, whatever, you are evacuated, but then you go back to your home and most of the things you relied on are gone. Maybe your wheelchair is gone as well, and you're just going to be told, well, just use this one. And we know that wheelchairs are extension of our skins. You can't just replace, a mobility aid with another one. And also, how are governments around you going to rebuild everything? If schools have been, flooded, are they going to rebuild it in a way that is accessible? If public transport has been disrupted, is the priority going to be we want disabled people on board, or is it going to be, well, we're just going to do the minimum, that's the only budget we've got for X and Y? So there is a really huge risk that we're going to be in a constant emergency mode, everything changing really quickly and being told well, actually, this is a luxury here. We've got bigger things to do.
I think, this is a very interesting point, because in countries where they're really implementing the CRPD, like here, the law requires that when new buses would be purchased, for example, that they would have to be accessible. There are all kinds of standards. I think one of the issues around destruction of the environment is the amount of money that it takes to rebuild it. The COP26 Climate Summit, did you attend?
I actually attended virtually, which was a really interesting experience. I attended one of the few disability and climate related events, and someone asked if there were any disabled people in the audience, and only 2 people raised their hand. And that just made me think, we're not there at all, even for when we're talking about an event about disability and climate. And obviously there were issues around, accessing the conference room itself with the Israeli energy minister who wasn't able to enter. If someone with so much power and network cannot enter a conference room, what about disabled people who have 0 networks and 0 power?
Also at COP26, there was the voiceless panel that you attended.
Oh, yeah. That was a very interesting experience. And by interesting, I mean depressing. It was presented as an event that was going to be about the marginalized voices, which we are in the climate conversation. So I thought that's great. And all of a sudden, the conversation moved to the need to have, vegan food at COP and banning plastic everywhere. And I just thought, first of all, there was no mention or reference to disabled people at all. Lots of references to fishes and animals, nothing about disabled people, which made me think, okay, we're not even there. A lot of climate activists are angry and frustrated for perfectly good reasons. But then it goes into zero cars, 0 plastic straws, 0 everything. And then we just don't exist in that space. And that's exactly what happened. And you know what? Before that voiceless event, I attended another event on climate, was looking at local councils in England and what they were doing about climate. And I asked a question about disability, and I said, okay, what is being done at a local level to include disabled people into, climate justice action, and what are you doing policy-wise? And the answer was, well, it's difficult. You can't please everyone. And that's very telling.
I would say that's an understatement. Wow. So let's talk a little bit about how disabled people can get more involved.
So if you're already part of the conversation and you've got a rough knowledge of the issues and how to engage with local policymakers, and I think the engagement is happening through different routes. It's either that you're part of a local community group of disabled people working together and asking questions about what is being done in terms of accessible transport, and by the way, is it greener, and how are you addressing those things together. If you're roughly already in the space, you're going to engage those groups and then link up with national organizations. You're going to, become part of a bigger network. If you don't know anything about climate and you're interested in the issue, I guess, again, your main pathway would be to look up what's happening online and being part of online forums, or, looking up information. If it's not accessible, it's obviously an issue. If you're already part of a group of disabled people working together, or part of a forum or anything, do bring up climate, ask people if they've done anything or saw anything, and find resources together. Try and engage with local climate groups. You can start your own group of people. If you know a few people online who are interested about climate, just build a small group and then link up with all the other organizations that are working on it, because I think right now there are so many organizations doing interesting things on climate and disability, but it's not very well organized. I think we're not really strong networks of knowing who is doing what where, and I think that's going to change in the next 2 to 3 years. So I think that's really important, and the most important message for me is that every disability activist should be a climate activist. Climate is going to change everything for us. It is the biggest threat to humanity. And even though we're often not treated as being part of humanity, we are. And you have a place, whoever you are, in the climate justice movement. And I know it can be hard to find it right now because the pathways aren't that clear and it feels like we're all trying to build our own things. But I think there are resources, there is energy, and there is appetite from a lot of organizations to do more and have more people on board. So don't despair if you've wanted to be part of this conversation and you felt that you couldn't. There is definitely space for you and we need you.
Thank you so much, Pauline. I really want to thank you for all the hard work that you're doing in this area. And thank you for your time.
Thank you for everything, Judy. And, likewise, always admired what you do when you continue doing. And thank you for, amplifying all our voices and continuing to create such a big, diverse, and amazing movement. Thank you.
History won't forget us or try to minimize our pain. And so